joining us now is Bryce Covert. Bryce is the economic policy editor for Think Progress. Before that, she was editor of the Roosevelt Institute blog. Her writing has appeared in the New York Daily News, The Nation, The Atlantic, The American Prospect, and others, including the New York Times. And that's what we're going to talk about. She has recently published an op-ed in the New York Times entitled I don't know if it's an op-ed or a column piece or whatever, but entitled "What's More American Than Inheriting a Fortune?" And it's about the inheritance tax. Bryce, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for bringing me on.
So why should Americans, there was a time when there was kind of consensus in this country about inheritances and about the wealthy sons and daughters of the elite and so on. Now it seems like people don't even care about the inheritance tax much as a political issue. Should they care, and if so, why?
It is sort of a strange phenomenon, particularly, I think, in this country. We think of the American dream typically as someone at the bottom of the income scale, using their grit and hard work to rise up to the top and, pull themselves up by their bootstraps, which the antithesis to that should be people who simply inherit money, calcified social classes where all the money remains at the top and just keeps passed down from dynasty to dynasty without much opportunity for everyone else to also rise up to higher levels. So you would think that would set the stage for a pretty robust estate tax, the estate tax being a tax that's levied on money that's handed down by very wealthy families and estates. That money then goes back into the government, and the government should be using that money then to help create opportunity for everybody else through education, all sorts of other things like that. Strangely, though, Americans don't like the estate tax. Polls relatively consistently show that Americans want to get rid of it. They don't want to make it stronger. And so while we've always had some sort of inheritance tax, and we enacted the current form of it around when, the 1920s, like the lead up to that, when we were having these really big concentrations of wealth at the top and monopolies, to get rid of all of that, today it is just not a popular policy, and it has played virtually no role in this campaign cycle.
Really interesting when you think about it, because I can remember when I was a little kid, there was a TV show called Dobie Gillis. And Dobie, the hero, was a teenager who worked in his dad's grocery store. And he was the kind of, self-made guy that you're talking about. And the kind of villain of the piece, the guy who was always chasing Dobie's girlfriend, was Chatsworth Osborne III, the rich kid who never had to do anything for his money. That was kind of what you were referring to, the American mythology that said, the self-made person is the backbone of the American dream. So back then, the inheritance tax was much higher, and when this TV show was on the air, and people kind of understood, if you work for your money, you should pay a lower tax rate than if you just got it because of the family you were born into. Now it's the other way around, and nobody seems to care that if you work for your money, you're likely to pay more in taxes, certainly above a certain point, than if you just inherit it from your rich parents. I mean, I don't even think the inheritance tax begins to kick in until, $5 million or something?
Yeah, it's around that. It affects 0.2% of the states. So right now it really touches very few people. A lot of people don't pay inheritance taxes. I tell the story a bit through the lens of the Trump family because say what you will about Donald Trump's father, Fred Trump. He got in trouble for some racial bias in his housing developments, but he at least looks like a Horatio Alger character. He started a construction business when he was a teenager after his father passed away. He built it up on his own with his mother. And that looks a lot more like sort of the American dream. Donald Trump, on the other hand, looks like the villain in that cartoon you're talking about. He basically has been handed most of his opportunity from his father. Beyond the fact, he talked about these loans that he got from his dad, the $1 million loan. He started out by sort of taking over one of his dad's very valuable businesses. he also got a very sizable inheritance from his father when his father passed away in 1999. And at that time, the estate tax was still relatively robust. In 1999, it was 55% on any money above $650,000. So whatever Fred Trump handed down, something like a couple $100 million, would have been taxed pretty heavily. Contrast that with under the George W. Bush tax plan, the estate tax was actually briefly phased out. So if someone passed away and passed down their money, for a short period of time, it faced zero taxes. And ever since that point, we really haven't gotten it back to anything like what it used to be when it actually had some sort of effect on wealth concentration. And we also know that during that period, as it starts to get weaker, wealth concentration in this country has gotten worse and worse, and wealth inequality has gotten back to where it was around the 1920s. So
Right.
we're just not doing much about it.
It's so interesting what you point out, that both the Trump story, but also the public's attitude about it. I mean, I watched, so that others didn't have to. I watched all of the Republican I covered it for the Young Turks, but all of the Republican town halls the other night, Kasich and Trump and Cruz, and Trump actually said several times, "Oh, my dad gave me a small loan to get started in business, $1 million." And, everybody thinks, or a lot of people think of Trump as a self-made man. And then you point out the 200 million that he probably paid some taxes on. But I guess my point is, when I wrote about the estate tax, I guess this is when I first started realizing the Huffington Post had a lot of reach. Like 10 years ago, Whoopi Goldberg wrote me to say how upset and she's a good liberal, on television, how upset she's worked hard for her money. She deserves to keep her, people shouldn't have to, this liberal figure writes to me to say, you're not being fair about the estate tax. And by the way, she prefaced it by saying, "I love your work," which is what you say in Hollywood. But I guess the point being that the popular culture figures of now, including Whoopi, who's great in many ways, I love her in many ways. I love her work. Is that somehow it's wrong and it's taking away from families to have somebody pay tax on $1 million or $5 million of income that they didn't earn, that somehow that's more wrong than asking a policeman or a firefighter or a doctor or nurse, teacher to pay taxes on what they earn. What happened? Our culture flipped inside out somewhere.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's a little bit baffling to me, because the public generally these days is very concerned about growing inequality, which can include wealth inequality, including Republicans. They also want the government to do something about it and are on board with the idea that the rich should pay more in taxes. However, when it comes to the estate tax, that begins to fall away. So I think some of it may be that this persistent idea, which I think is maybe the more pernicious part of the American dream, that we will all someday be rich, or at least I personally will someday be rich because I work really hard and that's the dream, and it's going to get to, those riches are going to come to me eventually. And when they do, I will have earned them, and I want my children to have them tax-free. So I think that may be a strong undercurrent. Another thing I heard from a lot of people who wrote to me after I published my op-ed was this feeling that there's something about death that can't be taxed. And this, of course, goes back, I think, to the Republican messaging around this being called the death tax and not the estate tax. But a lot of people saying when someone passes away, it's a very difficult time, we shouldn't tax them because it's already so emotionally fraught. And I sympathize, obviously, with how difficult it is to lose family members. But I do not think that can influence our policymaking when we know that it's good policy, it's progressive policy to tax inheritances so that we don't have wealth concentration, we don't have an aristocracy, and we do have money to fund more progressive things that can help everybody else get a little bit more of that economic mobility.
Yeah, I mean, you know what else? Look, I don't want to be unsympathetic. We've all lost people we care about, but and yes, it's a difficult time. But you know what else is a painful experience? Going to work every day at a crappy job because you didn't win the birth lottery, and you don't come from a wealthy family. So on that, I have to confess to being something of a hardcore populist. But there's also this myth, Bryce Covert, that somebody is being taxed twice. I heard that from Whoopi. You hear it a lot. That look, I paid taxes on it when I earned it. So if my kids have to pay taxes on it, then it's being taxed twice, which is not right. I mean, if my boss pays taxes on her income and then pays me, she's not being taxed twice. So real, and the same is true of the inheritance tax. But somehow I feel like that idea, the double taxation myth, has kicked in too. What do you think?
Yeah, I definitely heard that a lot in the responses to my piece. It surprised me a little bit. I mean, you could kind of say that about a lot of different taxes. You could say that if you're going to get really sort of pure about this argument, you could say that about the sales tax. Your income is taxed, and when you get it, and then you have to go and buy something, and you pay sales tax. I mean, taxes show up in lots of different places because
Right.
we have different activities that we think are worth taxing and funding the government with. I actually would say that the estate tax is less like that because you're taxing the money that's being inherited by people who didn't do anything to earn it except be related to you and, make it into your will. And that's
Right.
fine. It's also not to pass judgment on people who inherit money. I think that is, I'm not saying we should get rid of inheritances. I'm just saying that money should be taxed so that some of it can be put to public use, particularly when it's in such a large amount. I don't think the estate tax has ever been such at a high rate or kicked in at such a level that impacts, small businesses or it
Right.
impacts middle class families. We're always talking about millionaires. To quote Bernie Sanders, the millionaires and the billionaires. I mean, this is who we're
Right.
talking about when we talk about the estate tax. It's true today for sure because so few people pay it. But it was even true back when it was more robust. We're talking about the very top 1% of our
Right.
country who it will not be a huge difference for them, honestly, in their lifestyles if we're putting this robust tax on it, as it will be if you're inheriting, say, $10,000 from your grandmother.
Right, which is always the association I think that people make, and whoever you get the money from. I mean, you could be somebody who wasn't born into a wealthy family, but you host a radio show, and some billionaire decides to give you their fortune because they like your. I just want to throw that out there in case someone's listening. But Bryce Covert, I guess. But what I keep coming back to too is if I make money and then decide to hire somebody to fix my porch, I pay tax on my money, they pay tax on the money I pay them. That's not double taxing. I pay one time, they pay one time. If I make money and give it to my kids, that's not double taxing. I pay one time, they pay one time. But this double taxing thing has really fit into the zeitgeist. And I guess last topic to talk about with this, is it because the corporate the minions of the millionaires and billionaires have just successfully tapped into the subconscious brain in a way that other people have not figured out how to respond to, that it's about family, it's about death, it's about fairness, and that somehow, against all logic, if you think about it clearly, a much higher estate tax makes sense, but somehow they've managed to link the whole idea to these things. Well, I want to protect my family. I want to maintain the fantasy that I could be rich someday. I mean, these are all very kind of, to use that term, lizard brain type ideas. Is it, and I don't want somebody to suffer unduly when I die. Have they just tapped the lizard brain in a way that it's going to be hard to take back?
I think it has been very successful. Like I said, there's polling showing that even when you explain the tax to people, exactly what it does and who it reaches, Americans still want to get rid of it or at least weaken it. There was one poll that I saw after I published my piece. Someone showed it to me that held some hope, which is that if you tell people about the estate tax, same thing happens. Most of them want to get rid of it. But then if you talk about income inequality with them and growing trends in income inequality and ask them again, the support grows quite significantly. It's still not overwhelming support, but there is an increase, which I think shows us that the estate tax has just not been adequately linked to income inequality and wealth inequality, because I do think it's true that Americans care about it and want to do something about it. And if no one's talking about the estate tax, I mean, if Bernie Sanders, of all people, is not even talking about it in his campaign, he's not promising to do really all that much about it, and so therefore no one's combining it with the idea of income inequality, then those two things are just seen separately, and Americans aren't going to make those connections on their own.
Well, my solution is I'm going to bring back the Dobie Gillis show. But on that, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave. But Bryce Covert, economic policy editor for Think Progress, you write great stuff. Always appreciate having you on the program and appreciate your thoughts on this issue. So thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much.